Welcome back. We will now, as promised, look at the travels of Deen Muhammad. As you can see, I have also mentioned the other spelling that is used for Deen Muhammad. Uh, the travels of Deen Muhammad, a native of Patna in Bengal, through several parts of India, while in the service of the Honorable the East India Company, written by himself in a series of letter to a friend. It's published from Cork, printed by J. Connor at the Circulating Library, opposite the square, 1794, in 2 volumes, right? And there is a dedication also to someone who worked as a colonel in the East India Company. Now, a bit of a biography about Deen Muhammad might be in order here. His family, and as he recounts in his account, is deeply embedded in the Nawabi bureaucracy itself. They are claiming a distant kinship to the Nawab of Murshidabad. His family seems to have been part of the military of first the Mughal Empire and then the Bengal Nawabs themselves. His family stood below the elite levels of ranking officials called Mansabdars, and they have been serving these empires for a long time. Deen Muhammad, as we will get to know as we will read relevant portions from this travelogue, also attaches himself to the empire, now this time to the British Empire, at the age of 11. Company's Bengal army takes him up, or rather he attaches himself to Anglo-Irish officer Godfrey Evan Baker. Under this patron, he rises to the position of Subedar finally. Subedar is equivalent position of the lieutenant. In 1781, in 1782, he resigns from this position and chooses to emigrate to Ireland the next year, 1783. He settles in Cork and soon marries a young Anglo-Irish Catholic lady, Jane Daly. He then writes his Travels of Deen Muhammad in 1794, as is mentioned here. Now, very interestingly, Deen Muhammad does not write this account neither in Bengali, which would have been the language that he would have been very familiar with, nor in Persian or Urdu, which would have come to him because of his long association, because of his family's long association with the Nawab and the Mughal courts. But he writes this in English. And that's what is important about this travelogue itself, it's this book itself. Thereby, it tells us that he aligns himself not only to the language but also to the genres that are used in English at this point of time, the genres of the travelogue. And as Michael Fisher, in his essay that comes out in Modern Asian Studies, will tell us that travelogue at this point of time is a very important genre. As we all know, this is the height of colonialism, and travel writing becomes a significant method of colonial rule itself. That you have traveled, explored new regions, and you have had adventures in your life, and then you have been also able to, in the process of this adventure, capture some land. This is almost the kind of template that many of these travelogues are many of these travelogues have. It is such a popular genre that at this point of time, people are writing fictional travelogues also, that they themselves have not traveled to these distant parts of the world, but somehow, because the market has this insatiable demand for travelogues, people want to read about exotic lands, distant strange lands, that people are concocting stories in the form of travelogue. So, Deen Mohammed does not only align himself to the language English, but also to styles and genres of writing. And as it will be clearer, he is not only participating in the travelogue, his book is written in the epistolary form. Michael Fisher informs us that at this point of time, 1 out of the 6 books published in England are in the epistolary form, which again tells you of the predominance of these genres, the genres of travelogue and epistolary. What Deen Mohammed does is to bring together two very popular styles that are prevalent at this point of time with the English readers and give them a, an experience of India by an Indian. It is very important, the last part that I am talking about, that it is by an Indian, because as you will remember that the reader is going to read an account which is not by a foreigner, but about someone who is a native of the country about whom they are reading the travelogue. Because before this, whatever they read in English or in any other European language was by a foreigner about India. For the first time, an Indian is writing an account and claiming the rights of representation. And this is very important, and I want to highlight what it means in terms of the scheme of colonization. As you will realize, and through the readings of, and there are various readings of this, and one can go through them to understand the colonial rule which works through travel writing. And there is no better example than Columbus's journals himself, which are very well read by Stephen Greenblatt in his Marvelous Possessions, where he is looking at the journals of Columbus as important strategies of colonization itself. And again, I want to go back to the initial lectures where we are discussing how colonization is not only a military invasion or a conquest, it is also the conquest of knowledge. And what happens in a travelogue is part of those strategies of conquest of knowledge itself. Travel, as we will remember, at this point of time, in from 16th to 18th, 19th, 20th century, is almost unidirectional from the west towards the east to explore many different and diverse countries, strange lands and exotic lands. It's not from the east to the west, right? And also it's being written by Westerners about India or the East in general itself. So for Deen Mohammed to write an account of India is to deny that monopoly of representation that exists at this point of time. He claims what I will call the representational rights, that I can talk about the country that I was born in. Probably I don't live there, but I can talk about the country much better and probably with much more sincerity than everyone else. And you can see that in the first, in the title itself, right? So, in the title itself, he mentions that it is that he is a native of Patna in Bengal, and he has travelled through several parts of India. But then these travels, as we come to know through his account, are thanks to the colonial army itself, zones of employment as we were talking about, while in the service of Honorable East India Company, written by himself. Now, it is very important to understand that Deen Mohammed in this way creatively locates himself both to an old regime uh, and the Indian society in general, as well as to the British Empire, because he says that he was part of the Honorable East India Company, and to his British readers, that he's not writing this because he's writing it in English. At this point of time, we even, so by 1794, we don't have English as the language of instruction. That will happen only after 1835. The first generation of English educated, university educated students will be the people who will be like Bankim Chandra, who come to write the first novel in English in India, Rajmohan's Wife. That happens almost 70 years after this. So, he is definitely not looking at a readership in India comprised of Indians. He is definitely looking at a readership that is British mostly, predominantly, if a bit of European readership in that sense. So, he is locating himself liminally in that sense. He is locating himself in both the regimes, that he is part of India, his ancestry is part of the Mughal Empire, his ancestry belongs to the Nawabs, but he is part of the East India Company, and he derives his entire veracity from the fact that he was part of the East India Company, and he wants to reinforce this by offering this dedication to an official, a high ranking official in the East India Company itself. So, you have the dedication here not only as a marker of gratitude, that like you probably helped me in my service of East India Company and probably later something we don't know, but this dedication also helps him establish his credentials with the British readership, that this person is truthful, that this person, unlike many travelogues probably that are circulating in the market which are fictional, is not fictional. This person comes from real experience because he's traveled through several parts of India and he's a native himself. Now, very importantly, and this is very interesting and important at this point to highlight, that he has to claim that he has written it himself. And then I am reminded of a parallel which is not equal, but a parallel like the first autobiographies by African Americans like Frederick Douglass, who had to also insist that it is written by himself. In Douglass's case, it was accompanied by a letter from a white man who freed him from the clutches of slavery, so that the readership believes that a slave could write in English. that's why I am saying it's not a comparison of like and like, but here also Dean Mohammed is claiming his entry into discourse, into written text itself, that an Indian can be proficient in English, and thereby when he says himself, it's not fake. And because this kind of a claim might arouse a certain kind of suspicion from the British readership that, oh, can a native write in English, and that too in the genres of travelogue and epistolary form? That kind of proficiency can arouse suspicion. So therefore, Dean Mohammed is doing his bit to allay those suspicions by invoking British officials, by presenting the work in the format that it will probably be acceptable at this point of time, that it's printed by a white man, it's printed in Cork, it's not printed from some outpost of the colony in that sense, and it can be verified, if someone has any suspicion, can be verified with William A. Bailey. And then the dedication follows, and the dedication tells you that he has written this and that with sincerity of intention, and some degrees, if there is inadequacy of learning and refinement, he can be excused, because he is asking for benevolence here from the readers. So, it is very important for us to remember the kind of discourses that Dean Mohammed is participating in this text itself. In 18th century again, one of the devices that he is also deploying is this fictive reader that will be there, that he is writing it to as a series of letters, right? As we look at this content page, where it's a series of letters that he is writing to a friend, and like these are letter 1, letter 2, letter 3, and then it continues. It actually establishes a very interesting trajectory here. As I have been talking about it, Dean Mohammed's attempts here to write in the same form, the same idiom, claims that representational rights, reclaims that representational right. And in a sense, if you look at 1568, Father Stephens, and after that Ralph Fitch and others is writing, this kind of writing offers a counter discourse. And what do I mean by that counter discourse? If you look at the first letter itself, he will say this: "Dear sir, since my arrival in this country, I find you have been very anxious to have been made acquainted with the early part of my life and the history of my travels. I shall be happy to gratify you, and I must ingenuously confess, when I first came to Ireland, I found that the face of everything about me so contrasted to those striking scenes in India, so which we are wont to survive in this, with this kind of sublime delight, that I felt some timid inclination, even the consciousness of incapacity, to describe the manners of my countrymen, who I am proud to think have still more of the innocence of our ancestors than some of the boasting philosophers of Europe." In short, he is countering the discourse of British experiences in India. So, what we have here is someone who is critiquing, however mild that may be, critiquing the features of Europe, glorious Europe, as Macaulay would talk about in his infamous Minutes. He says, unlike the boasting philosophers of Europe, we are very innocent people. We have retained some innocence. This obviously undercuts the argument that the native is a cunning one, and would have been something that would have been very prevalent at that point of time, because this is just post Warren Hastings impeachment in that sense, where the argument was furthered that because of the exposure to the natives, the British have become corrupt, and the East India Company is engaged in acts of financial irregularities and corruption, right? So he turns the argument on its head and says, I like your country is great and everything, and I'm happy to write about my life and my travels and everything, but I want to establish first that we are very innocent people. We are not like what we have been described as, the cunning, smart natives who take the British for a ride. So what we have here then is a counter discourse. So for almost 200 years, till Deen Muhammad writes in English, we only have the British experiences of India, and we'll see how he counters those discourses. We'll talk about it in great detail in the next lecture. But it's very important to establish at this point of time that what we see here with Deen Muhammad is probably an example of counter discourse. And that also leads us to establish something that leads us to establish what Dharwadkar would call that the first English writing by an India is in the form of a counter discourse. So I'll also add to that that the first writing in English by an Indian also is an adaptation of the form, the canonical forms of travelogue and epistolary form itself. We will see as we go further how the Indians also adapt the forms of novel, how they adapt other canonical forms like poetry, and all of that begins with Deen Muhammad. Thank you.